Today is the plague of darkness, Makkas Choshech. As you know, we're learning the Rabbi Sichos on what I'm calling Exile and Redemption. We're doing the 10 Makkas, 10 plagues. Which means we can only learn what the Rabbi teaches. What the Rabbi doesn't teach, we can't learn, right? If the Rabbi doesn't talk about it, we can't learn about it. So it's not perfect. It's not like we're going through each one of the Makkas and explaining exactly what they were. For example, we had no Sicha on Arbe, grasshoppers, but we spent 3 weeks learning about Boyal Pare. This is the Makkas Choshech, the plague of darkness. And again, this is interesting. The Rebbe does not explain in this Sikha the plague of darkness vis-a-vis Egypt. He explains the plague of darkness vis-a-vis the Jewish people.
Inside.
In other words, we all, hopefully, at this point, have gotten the message that it didn't take Hashem 10 tries to get us out of Egypt. It wasn't like he kept fouling the ball off until he got us out of Mitzrayim. If the Eibush wanted to take us out of Mitzrayim, he would have taken us out of Mitzrayim. It doesn't take a lot of effort. But the Eibush created a world because he wants it. And he wants the people, and he wants the struggle, and he wants the work, and he wants the process. So the 10 Makkas, as we've discussed over and over again, are about an education. The Egyptians are being educated, the whole world, all of history is being educated, and the Jewish people are being educated. There's a lot going on in the 10 plagues beyond simply getting us out of Egypt. Hashem could have found many other ways to achieve that. So Makkas Choshech, the plague of darkness, which is the second to the last plague, like all the other plagues, is dynamic. Right? The Egyptians sat in darkness for a week, for 6 days. Right? 3 days and then 3 days more. 3 days they couldn't see, and then for 3 days the pasuk says v'yomesh choshech. The darkness was heavy. They couldn't move. They were frozen. They were paralyzed. And during these 6 days, the Jewish people went wherever they wanted. Right? There's a very sad medrash, which Rashi brings, that during that week all the Jews who didn't want to leave Egypt died. And there were funerals held that the Mitzrayim could not witness, because Hashem did not want them to rejoice in the death of their enemies. So in that week, there was a lot of levias. There was a lot of sad stuff going on as related to the Yidden. There were a lot of Jews who said, this is better. If we're slaves of the Egyptians, at least we can predict it. We're slaves of God, He's going to change the rules on us every day. Yeah. But in addition, we also know that the Jewish people in Egypt did not experience that darkness. Neither the lack of light, nor the heaviness that made the darkness like a tangible matter. And they maneuvered freely in Mitzrayim. And then there's another thing. That they went around checking out what the Egyptians owned. But they didn't take anything. They just checked it out. And then a couple of weeks later, they, quote, borrowed, end quote. And if the Egyptian said, I don't have, I said, well, you don't have. I saw it myself. I was in your house. When you were sitting in that chair not being able to move, I checked everything out. And of course the Egyptian said, so why didn't you take it? I'm an honest man. You're going to give it to me. And officially we borrowed it, but we never paid it back. No, there's a Gemara. The Gemara says that the Egyptians came to Alexander the Great, I think, with litigation. That they opened up the Chumash that we borrowed. We're a bunch of Ganav, and we borrowed all kinds of stuff. We never paid it back. We want our money back. So there was a fellow whose name, I can't remember. His name is famous, but who said, I'll argue. Said, sure, give us a bill for the stuff we borrowed, okay? But I want to give you a bill for the 200 years of servitude, of slavery, okay? And we'll negotiate with the difference. And then the Egyptians ran off. They said, you know what, you can keep the borrowed stuff. But we borrowed it. But we asked them for it. It was part of the way it was supposed to be. We had to ask for it. So the plague of darkness, which affected the Egyptians, and of course, the way it affected the Egyptians was that they couldn't move, affected the Jews. So, what the Rebbe does in the Sikha is analyze the plague of darkness based on a very, very simple supposition. And the supposition is that darkness is representative of Golus. The darkness representative of Golus. The plague of darkness was a metaphor for Golus. So now, before we get to the Sikha, how do we try that on the Egyptians? If we accept that Choshech is a metaphor for Golus, how would you explain that Golus vis-a-vis Egypt? Okay, you won't say, I'll say. the Egyptians experienced exile. They experienced what it means to be a prisoner, right? They were the masters. They were free. They owned the Jewish people. They experienced 10 plagues, and there's actually a Rashi, which we talked about last year, that says that the 10 plagues have a sequence. This is how you lay a siege to a city. You cut off the water supply, and you make a lot of noise, and you intimidate people, and you clank the weapons against one another, make a big noise, and so on. So one of the things, I guess, that you would do in defeating an enemy is you show them how it's going to look when they lose. In other words, the plague of darkness, as it relates to Egypt, was the experience of Golus. You want to know what your captives, what your slaves feel like? This is what it feels like. They can't move. They're stuck. And if you accept that premise, you could build a whole insight into the message to Egypt of the plague of darkness. That darkness has two conditions. If we're going to compare darkness to Golus, you have two stages in the decline, in the yerida that's associated with Golus. Number one, you don't know where you are. You're directionless. You don't know where you are. You know, one of the ideas which is brought in Hasidus about night, which is quite incisive, it's quite interesting. It's brought in Sforim. Is that one of the things about the night as opposed to the day is that if it's 10 minutes after sunset, or it's 10 minutes before sunrise, in your experience, the world is in exactly the same place. So if you didn't have a watch, and it's dark, it's not only that it's dark, you have no idea where in the darkness you are. Are you in the beginning of the darkness? Are you in the middle of the darkness? Or are you in the end of the darkness? Because until the morning, until you begin to see light, it might as well be midnight. And it could be midnight for the rest of your life. That's one of the unnerving characteristics of darkness. Besides the fact that it's dark, which means you don't know where you are. You don't know where you're going. Now you do know, the sun's going to come up. It came up yesterday, it came the day before, and the day before that. But when you're out in the darkness, unless you know how to read the motions of the moon and the stars, which will give you an idea of what time of night it is, the beginning of the night, the middle of the night, and the end of the night are identical. We've been learning Siddur now for 4 or 5 years. The first bracha that we say in the Berchat HaShach in the morning is Hanesin Lasech Vivina Lahavchen Ben Yema Ben Laila. He gave the rooster the intelligence to discern between day and night. And one of the ideas which is brought is to be in the middle of a night and have a sense of which part of the night you're in is very wise. It's very intuitive. Because most people, if it's night, unless you have a clock, you don't know if it's the beginning. In other words, the feeling of being vulnerable, the feeling of being without mastery and control of your situation is compounded in the night because there's the additional component. I don't know how long this is going to go on for because it's night, it's dark. And you're in darkness, right? All my parts are here. I got my arms, I got my legs, I got my wallet. Yeah, there's no boogeyman, there's no thief, bandit, robber to take my wallet and to kill me or to hurt me, God forbid, right? But he may be around the corner. I don't know. So right now, I got all my pieces. Everything is in order. But it's dark. And the darkness takes away from you a sense of purpose and direction. I'm sorry. It takes away from you a sense of purpose and direction. And it also takes away from you a sense of time. It says in Sforim, it says in Helikas Sforim, when you talk about Golus, that one of the characteristics of Golus is the chronic endlessness of it. Golus is not defined by acute pain, although there have been moments of acute pain. Golus is defined by what's the point and when is this going to end? What's the point? You want to punch me in the nose? Punch me in the nose. But don't have me sit in a chair in the dark for infinitum, forever. What's the point? What's the point? In other words, the torture of Golus is that it's not torture, it's just chronic darkness. That's what it is. It's chronic, where are we going? 1 minute before Mashiach comes, you're as close to Mashiach and your awareness as 1 minute after the base of Mikdash was destroyed. Now you know you're 2,000 years closer, but you don't. You don't. It's dark. And in darkness, you never know where the light is until you actually experience it. So, this Sikha is going to explain Choshech as it relates to the Jews. But we can extrapolate, which is what we're doing, how it relates to the Egyptians themselves. That darkness is an experience of, where am I going? It's only 3 days, 72 hours. It's not a lifetime, but that's not how you experience it. You experience it like it's forever. You experience it like it's forever. And then, of course, what happens eventually is that it absolutely paralyzes you. It immobilizes you. You become totally stuck, totally fixed. Is it from fear? Maybe, maybe not. It's not from anger, because angry people react, right? It's almost it's a depression. It's a depression. It's what happens when there's no control. If somebody hurts you and tells you why, you can deal with that. If someone puts you in a room and says, I'm not telling you when I'm coming back, and I'm not telling you why, that's real torture. It's torturous because it's not torture, because it's chronic nothing. So the Torah describes the darkness in Egypt as going from bad to worse. The Egyptians experience darkness. They can move around. They can find breakfast. They can find one another. They may be able to talk to each other. But what's going on? We can't see anything. We can't see we can't see our own hands. We can touch. We can talk. And it doesn't end. It goes on and it goes on. Everybody knows that the sun goes down at night and it comes up in the morning. And it didn't. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, there was no light. And it went on and on. It's only 72 hours. But for them, it felt like forever. And the end of it is that they were immobile. They couldn't move. Now, the way we understand it from the Rosh Chazal, it was actually a physical effect. There was something in their world that made them incapable of moving their arms and legs. They were stuck in their position. Like, nobody moved, right? So, but there's a psychological component to that also. I have a friend, I always tell this to my students, a friend who told me many years ago, he's a person who's had a difficult life. And he called me one day. In those days, I was his teacher. Now I'm his friend. He says, Rabbi, I had a chair episode. That made me... Who did he throw a chair at, or who threw a chair at him? I said, what's a chair episode? He said, you don't know what a chair episode is? I said, no. He says, I was sitting in a seat and I couldn't get up. Could you imagine being that depressed? Could you imagine being that depressed? Physically, could not get out of his seat. Physically, and I know him, and I believe him. You know, a person sits down on a couch and can't get out of the couch. Now, of course, the official reason is they have no reason to. The actual reason to is they have no energy. And no, the energy because they have no will. They have the will because they have no purpose. They have no purpose because they have no light. So that's what happened in the place of darkness. The Egyptians experienced what the Jews experienced for 100 years in 6 days. This is what it feels like to belong to somebody else. This is what it feels like to live, in the famous book from Elie Wiesel, a night. This is what it feels like. This is how it feels to be in darkness. And darkness, which even if you know it's going to end, is experienced as something which never ends. So at first, you navigate, you maneuver, and there's no light. And then you just can't move anymore. So I'm adding something that's not written here in the Sichos. All the Sichos says as the basis for the conversation that I had with you for the last 20 minutes or so is that the Rebbe equates Makkas Choshech with Golus. Now, what's going to happen in the Sicha is that we're going to associate Makkas Choshech with our Golus, not with the Egyptian Golus. But we're using that as a cue to translate as it applies to the Egyptian. On what grounds? Based on the idea that it says in Chazal, and Rashi brings it in Chumash, that when a nation lays a siege on another nation, to conquer them, to subdue them, to take them over, they take a series of steps. Right? You cut off the water supply, you make a lot of noise, you disrupt their civilization. And one of the things they do is you impose on them a chronic darkness. Now, you don't have to turn the lights out. You can leave the lights on. But you don't allow them to be in control of the light. They have no mastery over their own lives, which means you can be walking around in the daylight and it's dark, so dark that you can't move. That's the plague of darkness, if you will, philosophically. I'm giving you my own interpretation, because the Rebbe doesn't offer us interpretation. But what I shared today was how you would explain Makkas Choshech vis-a-vis the Egyptians. What's going to happen in the Sikh is that the Rebbe is going to spend Makkas Choshech vis-a-vis the Jewish people, and it's very interesting how the Rebbe does it. He's going to bring a Medrash and a Rashi and give us two perspectives of how we understand Makkas Choshech, and I'll see you in a week.